Hey everybody, it's Tom Woods, December 1st, 2012. Well, with secession in the news the past few weeks, Ron Paul got into trouble for saying that secession seemed to him to be a perfectly legal and morally sound thing to do. Nothing wrong with it. You have to have that right if you want to have a free country. And of course, he was immediately taken to task by the thought controllers in our society, Huffington Post and Salon and all these groups. How dare he say this? Doesn't he know there's a 3x5 card of approved opinion in this country that we enforce here at Huffington Post? And secession isn't anywhere near that 3x5 card. How dare he do this? In fact, any of us who consider secession or think it may be a viable alternative, what's wrong with us? I mean, don't we know that the American political spectrum is just a wonderful thing? I mean, you've got Obama and you got Romney. You know, what more could you want? Doesn't that include pretty much everything? How could you possibly want to secede from that? Or how could you possibly want some type of alternative? Or ask, heaven forbid, a fundamental question? Well, when you think about it, secession, the question of secession is basically raising this issue. Is it possible that the political unit could become so large as to be, even by government standards, dysfunctional? It seems pretty obvious that could happen. So why are we not allowed to raise that possibility? Like, why can't we even talk about this? Why isn't this just simply a prudential question that we could discuss as a matter of common sense? Why is it absolutely to be demonized and you're a criminal thought crime even to raise it? And also, like, why would it be that the number of square feet in the United States is like a heaven-sent number? Like, it's this many square feet, and if you want it to be slightly fewer square feet, then there's something wrong with you. Again, the union is supposed to be a practical thing. It's a means to an end, not an end in itself. The union is not something we're supposed to get down and worship or wave incense before. It's a practical thing, and yet the hysterics about secession, the hysterics who have been criticizing people who consider this idea, are treating the union as if it were an object of religious veneration. And this is bizarre and creepy, if you ask me. So, what are the arguments here? Well, leaving aside the moral argument would be nobody should be forced to stay in a political association that he does not want, as Ludwig von Mises put it. But let's even be sports. We'll leave that aside. There's the constitutional argument, the 10th Amendment, that the federal government is delegated only the powers that are mentioned in the Constitution, the remainder remain with the states. Well, the federal government was never delegated authority to suppress a seceding state. And the states are not prohibited from seceding in the Constitution, therefore it's a reserved right under the 10th Amendment. You don't have to have a secession clause in the Constitution. This is a complete misunderstanding of the whole structure of the Constitution. The only specifics that need to be in the Constitution are what the federal government can do. What the states can do, what the people can do, are not specifically laid out. There are specific prohibitions on the states, Article 1, Section 10. But that's not how the Constitution is structured. The Constitution only lists the specific things the federal government can do. Otherwise, it's assumed that the residual remains with the states, and so therefore secession is a reserved right of the states. Also, what are the fundamental units, the fundamental building blocks of the United States? The states, the peoples of the states. And so therefore, because the United States is not actually just a single indivisible blob of undifferentiated mass of individuals, because it is basically just a bunch of states together, those states can withdraw just as easily as they joined. Now, how do we prove this? Well, we look, for example, when the Constitution was ratified. Did they take a vote of the whole American people in the aggregate? Of course not. This would have been nonsensical to everyone. They went state by state and got each state's consent. Why? Because the states were the building blocks. And each state held a special ratifying convention because it was believed that the special state convention is the highest expression of the sovereign voice of the peoples of the states. The Declaration of Independence speaks of free and independent states, not a single blob, but free and independent states which have all the rights that any free and independent state like France or Spain would have. The states performed activities that we associate with sovereignty. So even before the Declaration of Independence, Massachusetts, Connecticut, South Carolina outfitted vessels to cruise against the British. It was the troops of Connecticut that took Ticonderoga. And in New Hampshire, the executive was authorized to issue letters of marque and reprisal. In mid-1776, when it came time to decide on laws pertaining to treason, it was declared that the crime of treason would be thought of as having been perpetrated not against some single aggregated blob, the United States, but against the colonies/states individually. The Articles of Confederation, Article 2, declared that the states retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence. That was 1781, that was ratified. Now, obviously, for the states to retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence, they must have had those things to begin with. So the United States fundamentally is a collection of societies. It's not a giant blob like every other country in the world. It's supposed to be a little different, remember? And it's supposed to be a collection of societies. Now, people will say, didn't that change with the Constitution? No, it didn't, and it couldn't. Because once you're sovereign, you're sovereign. If the peoples of the states are the sovereigns, they're always the sovereigns. And Emmerich de Vattel, one of the great international lawyers of all time, and certainly of the 18th century, said in his 1758 book, The Law of Nations, that if you have a sovereign body and it joins something like our federal union, it doesn't become any less sovereign. It joins that body through its sovereign voice, through its sovereign decision. And so if it chooses to take these powers back, it can do so. Obviously, if it is the sovereign body, it remains the sovereign body. It just simply temporarily delegates some powers to some other institution. Now, we've been taught to treat the Union like it's an object of religious veneration when it's simply a practical thing. We should be able to talk about these things, again, as a matter of common sense, just practical questions, talking about this, and yet we can't. And moreover, we're told that the Civil War settled all this anyway. Anytime you hear somebody say that, that's a person whose moral compass has been deeply deformed by government propaganda. I mean, that is a morally grotesque statement to say that the Civil War settled this question. Because when your kid comes home bloodied from the playground, do you say, well, kid, I guess you must have been in the wrong because look at how bloodied you are. I mean, that's sick. That's deranged that anyone would think that way. I mean, as my friend Bob Murphy puts it, we could just as easily say, well, I guess the idea of presidents who use violence to suppress secession, well, I guess John Wilkes Booth settled that one, didn't he? I mean, who talks like that? Or the Plains Indians, well, I guess the U.S. government settled that moral question. Moral questions are not settled by violence. At least civilized people, anyway, don't think that way. Now, think of the types of thoughts, though, that are totally excluded when we're not allowed to think about practical questions about the size of the polity or whether we should have secession. Imagine if we had a number of different countries in what is now physically the United States. Imagine if we had that. Jefferson thought that was entirely possible. He wasn't an idolater worshiping the Union. Well, I mean, would they all have the same crazy, lunatic Middle Eastern foreign policy? Probably not. Would they all have made the same catastrophic decision to enter World War I, which had terrible consequences in later decades, as we all know, for Europe? Would they all have made that dumb decision? Would they all be facing a fiscal cliff? I mean, these are reasonable questions. These aren't crazy. But they're not on that 3x5 card, so we're not allowed to ask them. Well, I say if you want to live in a free society, you've got to set a mash of that 3x5 card. And that's where I'll leave it. All right, a few quick announcements. I'll be this is 2012, I'm going to be at Michigan State on December 4th, this coming Tuesday. Details about that are at tomwoods.com. Also, woodsletter.com. Subscribe to my e-letter. I don't sell or rent that list. I send it out periodically, and every month, 10 people on that list I send free signed books to, so make sure you sign up at woodsletter.com. And then finally, the best way to evade the propaganda of places like Salon, Huffington Post, is to learn American history the right way the first time. Learn it from me and people I trust over at libertyclassroom.com. You won't be sorry you visited there, and thanks for listening.